welcome back. And what an honor and perfect timing for us to Skype in today all the way from Tel Aviv. And that's Ruthie Blum. She's a former advisor in the office of the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, award-winning columnist, senior contributor to and editor at the Jerusalem News Syndicate, and the co-host with Ambassador Mark Regev of the Israel Undiplomat. And there she is. The website is jns.org, and there it is, the Jerusalem News Syndicate picture of that landing page. Ruthie, so good to see you. How are you?
It's good to see you again, Perry. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. It's dinner time over there, right?
Yes, it is. But actually, I happen to be at the moment in New York City, where I came to visit for a short visit, and I'm returning to Tel Aviv the day after tomorrow.
Okay. Well, nice to have you, and thank you for your time. We value it greatly. A lot to talk about. What's your take on the recent ceasefire agreement?
I think it's a disastrous agreement that it's possible we couldn't refuse. When I say we, I mean the government of the State of Israel that was taking its cue from the majority of the public. Now, though the public is the majority is in favor of the war, the majority voted in this right-wing government. Nevertheless, the fact that 90 remaining hostages are still in Gaza means that in a year and 3 months, we were unable to rescue all of them. There were 251 in the beginning, a year and 3 months ago, and or almost 4 months, by the way. So at this point, people were they're weary, and the families of the hostages are devastated and terrified, as would we all be. So though it's a terrible deal, many people decided to risk it.
All right. So do you have a number? Is it 90 that remains?
Well, now 7 were just released. There were 90 remaining, and by Thursday, 3 more are supposed to be released, and then by Saturday, another 3. Now, we'll see if that happens, because you cannot trust Hamas, a bloodthirsty terrorist organization, to uphold any kind of deal it makes. So we'll see, okay? But at the moment, there are 90 still in Hamas and Islamic Jihad dungeons.
Do we know they are alive?
We don't know. We know that some are alive. First of all, we saw last week 3 live hostages return, 3 women, 3 young women, and then another 4 young women. So we know they were alive. And Hamas apparently gave Israel a list of the 33 hostages that are to be released by the end of the 6-week ceasefire, claiming that 8 of them are dead. Now, we don't know which, because as part of Hamas's torture, it won't reveal who's alive and who's dead.
And part of this is the release of Palestinians, and it looks like it's like for every 1 Israeli or U.S., it's 20 to 30 Palestinians. Is that correct? 30
to 50, depending on whether the Israeli was in uniform at the time, is considered a soldier or a civilian. So far, we have released from Israeli prisons, I believe, nearly 300 Palestinian terrorists. Now, keep in mind that they are bound to repeat their actions, because they're jihadists, and their whole goal is to annihilate the state of Israel, to kill Jews, Christians, and Muslim infidels, I say in quotes. They will repeat, their offenses will be repeated. They have vowed, Hamas has vowed to repeat the October 7th massacre again and again and again. So, it's a terrible risk, but the risk is not only because the terrorists were released. It's also because we had to open the Netzarim corridor to let Gazans who had been moved to the south in order for us, in the south of Gaza, that is, from northern Gaza, in order to clean out the hornet's nest in northern Gaza, and that is tunnels and weapons and terrorists. But you see now, hundreds of thousands of Gazans are returning to northern Gaza, and most maybe are on foot, some in cars. The only people being inspected for weapons and to see if they're terrorists are the ones in vehicles. The ones on foot are not being inspected. And that's a very dangerous situation. Furthermore, Hamas, that has stolen all the humanitarian aid that this deal has forced us to increase. We've been giving humanitarian aid all along. And Hamas has stolen it, sold it to Gazans for huge prices, and then used the proceeds to recruit new terrorists to replace those killed by the Israel Defense Forces.
So the migration back into Gaza from the south is a combination of not only terrorists, but civilians that could be used again as human shields, correct?
Oh, absolutely. The Gazans who are not terrorists, and I have to say something, I know it's controversial, most of them are terrorists. And when I say most of them, even the women and children, if a child who's 10 years old is shooting an RPG at you, he's a terrorist. Now, in fairness to the children of Gaza and of Judea and Samaria in the Palestinian Authority, they are raised to want to kill Jews and raised to be martyrs. Mm-hmm. They glorify terrorists, they glorify martyrs. Now, a young child is like, he's malleable. So you can't really blame the children for believing the lies and entering a death cult that their parents put them in.
Mm-hmm. No, that's one of the mind-boggling things that we witness here in the West. We just can't wrap our brain around that. So let me ask you this, Ruthie. When these three women got out, there was stories that they were kept in UN facilities. Question number one, is that true? And question number two, wouldn't that make the UN somewhat complicit?
First of all, yes, it's true. They weren't kept the whole time in UN facilities. They were moved around so that they couldn't be found and rescued, of course. They were moved from tunnels to certain private homes. And when I say private homes, you have to understand that civilians in Gaza include doctors and journalists who were holding hostages in their homes. So I don't care if they're journalists or doctors, they're terrorists. Anyone who holds a hostage is a terrorist. However, they were placed in tent encampments that the UN had set up to provide humanitarian assistance to displaced Gazans. Now, why were these hostages put in there? Because Hamas knows that Israel will never attack a civilian structure, never target civilians. So these hostages were placed among civilian Gazans to prevent the IDF from coming near there or attacking it. And that is true. And yes, the UN is complicit. We know that. Do you realize that UNRWA, the UN body responsible for so-called Palestinian refugees, by the way, perpetuating the refugee crisis, UNRWA has many, many members of UNRWA. UNRWA teachers, employees, took actual part in the October 7th massacre, raping, beheading, burning, and abducting. They actually took part. Then there are the ones who give tacit support. The UNRWA teachers have been caught all over social media praising terrorism. Those teachers teach the kids. They help with the school books and teaching jihad. And the greater UN has been terribly complicit by sanctioning Israel, by condemning Israel, rather than the terrorists.
Yeah. Yeah, again, mind-boggling. Let me ask you this, back to the deal. It looks like, I understand the deal was a bad one, but it was the only one on the table at the moment. With the understanding, from what I understand, Ruthie, you can correct me here, it was the deal to get the hostages back, knowing that this deal is basically a pause to reload and a future conflict is coming. Right or wrong?
You're absolutely correct. And the worst part about this deal is that it's not to release all the hostages. That the second phase of the deal, which is supposed to come after 42 days of the first ceasefire, the second part is where new negotiations are conducted. And during that period, Gaza is supposed to demilitarize. And then these negotiations are for the rest of the hostages and for Israel to withdraw every single soldier from Gaza. Now, and to open up all the corridors and to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor, which separates Gaza from Egypt. Now, first of all, the chance of Gaza demilitarizing or Hamas putting down its weapons, that the chance is zero. So the only question, furthermore, we don't know how many hostages we'll get back in exchange for each phase, the next phase of this deal, the second phase. Now, the chances of some kind of peaceful arrangement here are nil. And yes, we need all the hostages. But if this deal had been, we'll return all the hostages in exchange for all these Palestinian terrorists in jails, I think almost every Israeli would agree to it, even though it's dangerous for Israelis who are going to be murdered and kidnapped. But still, I think most Israelis would say, okay, let's get them all out, and then we'll figure out what to do. But that was never on the table. Hamas never agreed to release all the terrorists. And another neat trick it pulls is to say, it's also true, but is to say, well, we don't exactly know where this one and that one is because Islamic Jihad is holding them.
Okay, so, gosh, it appears to me that if this is not an all-release hostage release deal, and some remain, that their future is probably pretty bleak.
It's terribly bleak. And here's the thing, and here's the hope. All right, now it's interesting because President Trump yesterday, or the day before yesterday, said, why don't we move all the Gazan civilians who are suffering to Egypt and Jordan, either for a temporary solution or a permanent one? In other words, build them nice housing, let them live in peace. These people have been under war, they've been fired at, now I know, by the IDF, but that's all because of Hamas using them as human shields in hospitals, in mosques, in their homes. So it sounds reasonable, right? But no Arab country wants them. Jordan and Egypt say no, nothing doing. Nobody wants the Palestinians in their territory because I'll tell you the truth. You think the Arab countries don't know what kind of unrest that will bring them? They know. Second of all, Jordan already treats its many Palestinian residents as second-class citizens. And Egypt has outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. Nobody wants them, and that's understandable. But when Israel tries to solve the problem, Israel gets blamed.
All right, let me take a quick break. But before I do, let me ask you one quick question. Do we know how many Americans there are?
I believe there are, if I'm not mistaken, 6 or 7 who have dual American-Israeli citizenship. One of these Americans is rumored to be in the next release, either on Thursday or on Saturday.
Okay. Let me take a quick break. I got more questions for Ruthie. Such an honor to have her today. You can go to jns.org, which is the Jerusalem News Syndicate. .org. That's her website where she contributes. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. Such an honor to have with us, and very timely. Ruthie Blum's back with us. She's a former advisor there in the office of the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. She's an award-winning columnist and senior contributor to the Jerusalem News Syndicate, and that's her website, jns.org. And there's the picture of that landing page. We're Skyping her in from New York. She'll be heading back to Tel Aviv here in the day or so. Ruthie, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question. Given all the things we've talked about so far, I don't want to be oversimplistic here, but if Iran was neutralized, that's got to be the game changer of everything, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That would open up so many possibilities. You see, Hamas, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, like the Houthis in Yemen, the militias in Iraq, all of these are Iranian proxies. So that's, first of all, Iran really is the culprit here. So if Iran were to be starved of its funding and its nuclear facilities were destroyed, and if its ayatollahs were assassinated, as Israel assassinated many of the Hezbollah leaders, it would completely incapacitate the regime in Iran. It would free the Iranian people from the bondage of the Ayatollah-led regime. Iranians traditionally were very friendly with Israel and with the West. The Shah of Iran really liked the West. So we would return to better days, but also then Iran would not be able to fund its proxies all over the world. And that would change the whole situation in the Middle East. It would also, alongside this, Saudi Arabia, that is also an enemy of Iran, Saudi Arabia would also speed up the path to normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and a greater alliance between Saudi Arabia and the United States.
So Saudi Arabia is kind of an interesting part of all this. Do you think they'll become part of the accord before some kind of action is taken against Iran?
It's hard for me to believe. I can't say for certain, but I do know that Saudi Arabia gave its tacit approval to the Gulf states that signed the Abraham Accords. But it was waiting, as they did, to make sure that the strong horse in the world against the Iranian threat was, first of all, the United States, and second of all, Israel. And when Trump was in office during his first term, and Israel went to before Trump entered office, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed a joint session of Congress when Obama was still president, and he urged Congress not to sign the nuclear deal with Iran. It went ahead anyway. But during that speech, the Gulf states were so impressed that the Israeli prime minister stood up to the president of the United States that it saw Israel as a strong horse. Then when Trump took office and ripped up the nuclear deal, that showed that America is the greatest superpower in the world and Israel is its ally, and Saudi Arabia was moving close to making a deal, and then the October 7th massacre happened. And then Saudi Arabia was sitting on the sidelines watching to see, because if Israel is defeated or America didn't stand by a victory over Iran's proxies, I think it would damage the Abraham Accords, and certainly Saudi Arabia wouldn't be interested in having any part of it.
So Ruthie, if there is an effort to neutralize Iran, and I want to be careful here, but it seems to me in order to make it permanent and lasting, it would have to include a regime change, don't you think?
Well, of course. But before there's regime change, first of all, we know that regime change has to come from within. But the Iranian people are terrorized by the Ayatollahs. They are jailed, they're tortured, so they're having trouble doing it. And by the way, whenever they have tried to rise up against the regime, as they did, for example, when Obama took office, he abandoned them. So the issue is not whether regime change can come from the outside, but neutralizing the threat of the Ayatollahs, removing them of their power, would enable the Iranian people to rise up and decide what they want to do inside Iran.
That makes total sense, because there's several things on the table. One, it's possible that Israel would take out their nuclear capabilities and perhaps even some of the refineries, and the Trump administration would return with tariffs and restraint economically. The combination of those two could create an environment where the citizens could take control again.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you something. If anybody watching your program believes that Israel needs U.S. troops on the ground anywhere in the Middle East right now, or certainly not in this war and not against Iran, I would like to reassure them that that isn't what Israel wants. Israel has all along wanted in its ally, the United States, just not to have its hands tied the way that the Biden administration did since October 7th, 2023. And I believe, and that is one of the reasons Israelis were really, really happy that Trump won the election, because and especially with his dream team of the Secretary of State and Defense and National Security Advisor, the idea being that the one thing they will not do is abandon their ally Israel, and they won't, let's say, withhold weapons that Israel purchased from the United States, and won't turn their back on Israel being on the front lines of a war that's against the West.
One other question. Given all the complexities over there, which is so amazing, what's Israel's view now of another little pesky problem with Turkey and Syria?
Oh, that is a serious problem. But at the moment, Israel is still dealing with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, it is because, you see, even through Syria, there are still weapons being transported to Hezbollah. Israel's ceasefire, 60-day ceasefire in Lebanon, the deadline was up, but Israel has to stay there in southern Lebanon and continue to operate against the terrorist threat there. So now Turkey is a problem, has been a problem for Israel for many years now, because Erdogan is a Holocaust denier. He's an anti-Semite. He openly accuses Israel of genocide. But Turkey has been an ally in the past. And so the question is, what will happen inside Syria? Because Turkey might be going to commit its own genocide against Kurds in Syria. The point, though, is that Israel can't fight every front all simultaneously. And I think that right now, the Israeli government is waiting to see how things unfold in Syria and is watching very carefully.
But Israel's already moved to kind of militarily neutralize Syria, which was a smart move. But that gives them some time and space, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And that was in 2007, taking out the Syrian nuclear reactor. Correct. If Syria had been nuclear, who knows what the situation would have been right now.
In the meantime, apparently, Prime Minister Netanyahu has talked to our Secretary of Defense, our new one, Pete Hegseth. Basically, the Secretary is saying, what do you need? It looks like there's a story out in the American news press today that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants to come to the White House and meet with the president ASAP. And the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is basically saying to Netanyahu, what do you need? That's got to help the citizens over there knowing that somebody's got their back. Oh,
absolutely. And listen, after all this time under the Biden administration that spent most of the past, since the October 7th massacre, most of that time reprimanding Israel, warning Israel, withholding weapons, and insisting on a Palestinian state. We saw so many members of that administration basically accusing Israel of things rather than focusing on the bigger threat. Even though, I have to say, the Biden administration acknowledged that the obstacle to any deal to release the hostages or have a ceasefire, the obstacle was Hamas. even the Biden administration, every member of it had to acknowledge that. Because members of the Israeli public on the left were accusing Netanyahu of being the obstacle to a deal to release the hostages. And so, it was a mess. And now I think you have the new sheriff in town, very, very important, because with Israel, like the rest of the West, needs a strong America, which is why America First does not contradict America standing with its allies.
Is Hezbollah kind of, I know it's not totally neutralized, but it's been knocked down. Is it manageable right now?
Well, it's been totally decimated. So many of its leaders were assassinated, and so many of its weapons were taken out. And now, because of what happened in Syria with the overthrow of the Assad regime, it's harder to get weapons through Syria into Lebanon. However, even during this whole 60-day, which has passed, by the way, the 60-day ceasefire in Lebanon, brokered by Amos Hochstein from the Biden administration, there are still, IDF soldiers are finding still more evidence of tunnels, tons of weapons. And so, it's not over till it's over in that sense.
Ruthie, thank you to let us squeeze into your time while you're here in the States, and I know you're heading home certainly. Thank you so very much. I look forward to more visits. Let me say to our viewers and listeners, you can track a lot of her articles there at the jns.org. There's a picture of the website. JNS stands for the Jerusalem News Syndicate. Take a look at that, jns.org. Thank you, Ruthie. Safe travels as you head home.
Thank you so much, Perry.
Okay, God bless.